After having discussed these four pillars and also how important it is to really understand that organization skills matter in this new context, we are going to keep moving. I'm going to insist one more time on your sharing your expectations, sharing the end of the road, whether it is that you are mentioning the end of the unit, what is it that students will be expected to do at the end of the unit, but also what is it that they will be expected to do or achieve by the end of each of the lessons within a unit. Let me show you a couple of examples, all right? For example, learning goal. We are learning to infer the author's message and use evidence from the text. And the success criteria is, okay, well, for that, I used picture clues or facial expressions, for example. I used my background knowledge, what I already knew. I used evidence from the text, and then I put it all together. So as you can see, it's like the learning goal is the big thing and the success criteria is like the specific things related to that learning goal. For pretty much the same, but a little bit more complete, we are learning to make an inference by combining evidence from the text with our schemata, our prior knowledge, and the success criteria is I can use evidence from the text, I can use clues from the illustrations, I can use my prior knowledge, my schema, I can combine the evidence with my schema to make an inference, and I can use proper language in my responses, like I infer that. So I'm going to be showing you other examples so that you really get it. We've got the learning goal here, the big thing. We are learning to get the main idea from a text. That's what I want my students to be able to do by the end of a sequence of lessons. For example, I'm going to work on this so that they grasp or they grab the main idea from a text. And the success criteria has to do with I can skim, pay attention to the title, the illustration, topic sentences, the introduction and the conclusion. I can see, I pay attention to the paratext, for example. I can see and I think and I can wonder, and I can scan answers to WH questions like who, when, where, why. Another example would be for the learning objective, we are learning to describe a pet, okay? So by the end of this unit, probably, or by the end of a sequence of lessons, students will be expected to describe a pet. So success criteria, I can name the different pets, I can identify and name the different parts of animal bodies, I can use adjectives to describe pets and their body parts, and I can say what pets have and don't have. They have 4 legs, they have a tail. And one more example, learning objective. By the end of a sequence of lessons, I want my students to be able to write an informal letter. So within the success criteria, I can identify an informal letter from any other type of text. I can differentiate a formal letter from an informal letter. I can identify the different parts of an informal letter, okay? And I can write a suitable opening paragraph. I can structure my letter so that it runs smoothly to the reader, and I can write a closing paragraph. So you see, we've got like the global learning objective and the specific objectives. So if you remember, in Module 3, we mentioned this question of global learning objectives and specific objectives, and I made an analogy with candy, okay? So like the global learning objective is like candy in the sense that when you unwrap it, there's stuff inside, all right? So what do we have? The specific learning objectives. And something really very important to reflect upon now is there's an A and an F here, and I'm going to clarify this in a second. What does this mean? Okay, I've got a global learning objective, and when I open it up, there are different specific learning objectives. Each of these specific learning objectives need to be assessed and feedback needs to be provided. So it's not that I am assessing only the big one. I have to assess each and every of those specific learning objectives. Of course, not all of them formally. Remember that assessment is ongoing and that there are many types of assessment. So each of these specific learning objectives needs to be assessed and feedback needs to be provided. Remember that the role of feedback here is that students can keep making progress. I hope you're not too hungry or that you are not very fond of candy, but I'm using this analogy because I am particularly very visual, and for those of you who are visual, this is going to help you. So this final task or this mini project that we plan for the end of a unit or the end of a sequence of lessons is going to be this scenario, this situation in which all the specific learning objectives are going to be part of, okay? So thinking now, a final task might be that students actually give an oral presentation about their family, or that they create a photo album with photos from their family, and they are part of this kind of show and tell to talk about the different photos and talk about their families. So if that's going to be my final task, what specific learning objectives do they need to be presented with? Which ones do they need to practice? And which ones do they need, of course, to transfer to this scenario? Well, probably they will have to learn vocabulary related to members of the family. They might have to learn this is my as a structure. If they will be describing the members of the family, they might need vocabulary for physical description and structures for describing people physically. So as you can see, this big final task or mini project is the opportunity for students to show what they can do and that they can actually do what I said from the very beginning as learning objectives. That's why it's really important that we socialize, that we share these learning objectives with students from the very beginning so that they already know what will be expected from them. All right? So let me give you a couple of examples. So for example, now for this remote task, it's your turn. What did you do last summer? Remember to write verbs in the past. This is an example of a reminder, okay? This is something that I would have normally discussed in class, but since I'm not with my students face to face, I'm just reminding them. So this is the final scenario. I want them to tell me about what they did last summer, all right? Now the question is, what is it that I need to work on first so that when the time comes for them to do this autonomously and with confidence, they are absolutely ready? Well, for sure, I must have worked on verbs in the infinitive and verbs in the past. I must have presented this and they must have practiced it. They must have been given this noticing, remember, these noticing opportunities, okay, in which students will be working out these inductive moments. For example, in this case, inductive grammar, when students will be working out how or when we use verbs in the past. Of course, they must have had exposure, all right, to for example, in this case, there's another boy talking about what he did last summer, okay? The importance of providing models, of modeling first. So as you can see, we've got all the specific embedded in the global learning objective. So for example, if by the end of a lesson or by the end of a sequence of lesson, I expect my students to imagine they are doctors and they have to give tips for a patient to keep fit and live a healthy life. So if they are communicatively engaged in a task in which they will have to give advice for a patient to be fit and healthy, what is it that must happen before? Well, for sure, I will probably have to present them with the vocabulary that they will need, vocabulary related to health and fitness. And of course, I will also have to present them with the structures that they will need, okay, to give these tips to the patient, okay? Like if you have a headache, okay, something that you can do is take an aspirin. So in this case, probably because it's part of my syllabus, I have to teach conditional here it's conditional 0. So I have created a context for this to be meaningful to my learners. And of course, after presenting it and having this integrated presentation of vocabulary and grammar, of course, I must have engaged my students in, as we very well discussed, controlled practice and freer practice. And all throughout, as we were presenting and as we are moving from controlled practice to freer practice, and as I am receiving these assignments done by my students, I need to provide them with feedback, okay? And I constantly need to back them up, because I cannot wait until they get to this final task or project for them to show that they are having problems with what were my learning objectives. So the idea is to have intervention as students are moving towards that final task or project. So as I said, we are moving towards the end, and we need to recap and reinforce. So I'm going to insist on, and this has been my intention for this entire workshop, in the sense that I want you to realize that the ABCs of effective lessons and good teaching skills are transferable to a number of situations. That even though now we found ourselves unexpectedly forced into remote teaching and learning, those skills that really are really critical in a traditional classroom are transferable to this new situation. So it's really very important that now we round up how important feedback and paying attention to evidence is. And remember that something I've been highlighting all throughout is that this evidence is not just for me, but it's mainly for my students, all right? So it's really very important that we socialize learning objectives of a lesson in particular, or a set of lessons, or a whole unit, so that students know where is it that they are going. As we move throughout a lesson or a sequence of lessons or a unit, we need to stop at certain moments to ask ourselves, where are we now? All right? Where are we now, and how far are we from where we need to go? And the question that appears there on the screen is, how do I close the gap? The gap between where I am and where I need to go. And these are the decisions that I've been mentioning, are the result of feedback and the evidence that we gather through powerful assessment. And when I talked about decisions, I mentioned that these decisions are decisions that you have to make as a teacher as for your instruction, and decisions that students have to make as learners that they are.